What would you do if the only thing standing between you and the truth was a door nobody had opened in 60 years? We've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over like a stone found at the edge of a river, wondering what lives underneath. It isn't the kind of story that announces itself. It came quietly the way most important things do. So stay close and let us tell you about Adeline Holt. Adeline Holt arrived in the town of Bluff, Tennessee, with $31 folded inside her boot, a canvas satchel on her back, and a wood-handled draw knife wrapped in an old flour sack that she carried separately, the way you carry something you are not willing to lose. She was 22 years old. She had buried her teacher 6 weeks earlier and been asked to leave the house she'd lived in for 4 years the morning after the funeral. Asked by the teacher's son, who smiled while he said it and held the door. The draw knife had belonged to Emmett Farrow. He had pressed it into her hands the week before he died, when he could still sit up in the chair by the window, when the autumn light still found him. He'd been a chairmaker his whole life, 60 years of green wood and spokeshaves and the smell of fresh shavings, and he'd taught Adeline everything he knew. Not because she was family. She wasn't. She was an orphan girl from the county home who'd knocked on his door at 17, asking if there was any work, and he'd looked at her hands and said, "Come in out of the cold." She came to Bluff for no reason more complicated than that the bus stopped there, and she was out of money. It was a small town pinned to the side of a ridge, the kind of place where everybody knew the shape of everybody else's troubles. There was a sawmill, a church, a hardware store, a diner that smelled of burnt coffee and good pie, and a long street of houses that leaned slightly toward the valley like they were listening for something. She found a room above the hardware store for $6 a week and a part-time job sweeping the floors of that same store for $4. The math didn't work, not quite, but it was close enough to try. The owner of the hardware store was a man named Herschel Dodd. He was 60, short, wore the same gray suspenders every day, and spoke in the clipped, efficient way of a man who'd been too busy his whole life to bother with extra words. He paid Adeline on Fridays and never asked her anything personal, which she appreciated more than she could say. She would sweep the wide plank floors in the early morning, before the store opened, the quiet interrupted only by the distant sound of the mill and the soft whisk of the broom, and then she would go upstairs and work on the chairs. She had brought her tools, not just the draw knife, but the spokeshave, the travisher, the brace and bits, the small marking gauge that Emmett had made himself from a scrap of walnut. She had almost nothing else, but she had those, and in the evenings she sat at the narrow table in her room and worked on commission pieces, chairs ordered by a furniture dealer 2 towns over who had been one of Emmett's customers and agreed to take on his student if the quality held. So far it had. The townspeople watched her, the way small towns watch newcomers. They saw a young woman, slight and self-contained, who carried a tool roll the way other women carried a purse. She moved through the aisles of the hardware store in the mornings with a quick, purposeful stride, and she spoke to people politely but did not linger. They called her the chair girl, in the way towns assign small, harmless labels to people they haven't figured out yet. She heard it and did not mind. She had been called worse. There was one place in Bluff that she walked past every day and every day thought about. It sat at the far end of Mallow Street, set back from the road behind a row of overgrown lilac bushes that had gone half to wood. It was a house, or had been. 2 stories, clapboard, once painted white and now the pale gray of old ash. The porch sagged on one end. Every window was shuttered. It had the particular stillness of a place that has been closed for a very long time, not abandoned carelessly but shut, deliberately, as if someone had gone through it room by room, pulled every curtain, latched every shutter, and locked the door knowing they would not be back. Herschel told her it had belonged to the Mercer family, that the last of them, an old woman named Agnes Mercer, had died some years back, and the estate had been in dispute ever since. A nephew from out of state claimed it. The county said otherwise. The lawyers had been corresponding for 6 years. In the meantime, the house sat. What Herschel didn't mention, and what Adeline learned from the woman who ran the diner, was the other part of the story. The part people said with lowered voices over coffee. Agnes Mercer, before she died, had told her pastor that there was something in that house she wanted the town to have. Something she'd kept safe her whole life. Something her father had hidden there during the bad years, and that she had never known how to give back. The diner woman, whose name was Florence Rausche, and who had the particular gift of making a piece of information feel like a secret even when it wasn't, leaned across the counter and said it in the way of someone delivering a verdict. Agnes Mercer went to her grave with whatever it was still locked inside that house, and nobody's been in there since. Adeline walked home that evening, with the draw knife tucked under her arm, and the story turning itself over in her mind. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself she had enough to think about. She sat down at her workbench, picked up the spokeshave, and tried to think about the chair she was shaping, about the angle of the seat, about the moisture content of the hickory, about the things that were hers to think about. She lasted about 4 days. It started with a simple question she put to Herschel, the kind of question that pretends to be idle curiosity. She asked him who held the keys to the Mercer house while the estate was in dispute. Herschel looked at her over the top of his glasses for a moment, then went back to his invoice. "The county clerk," he said. "Fellow named Amos Spear." Then he added, without looking up, the way a man adds something he's thought about and decided you should know. Agnes Mercer was a good woman. Whatever's in that house, she wanted it to mean something. Adeline went to see Amos Spear. Amos Spear was the kind of county official who had grown so thoroughly into his desk that it was hard to imagine him vertical. He had the look of a man constructed entirely for sitting, and a face that arranged itself naturally into suspicion. When Adeline explained that she had a professional interest in any furniture remaining in the Mercer house, that she was a chairmaker, and had heard the estate contained pieces of possible historical value, he looked at her the way you look at someone you are fairly sure is lying, but cannot quite prove it. "What kind of professional interest?" he said. "The kind that might help establish an accurate inventory for the estate proceedings," she said, which was something she had thought of on the walk over, and which had the advantage of being possibly true. He told her no. He told her the house was sealed pending the resolution of the dispute. He told her that no one had been authorized to enter. He told her all of this while already reaching for another form on his desk, as if the conversation was already finished. As she walked out, a voice came from the bench along the wall, the waiting bench where people sat before being told no by Amos Spear. An older man, very thin, in a worn canvas jacket, who had apparently been sitting there long enough to hear everything. He had the kind of face that had been in the weather for decades, lines deep as creek beds, eyes the color of winter sky. He looked at Adeline and said, very quietly, "You're the girl from the hardware store. The one who makes chairs." She said she was. He said, "I knew Emmett Farrow. Bought a rocker from him in 1959. Best piece of furniture I've ever owned." His name was August Yell, and he had been a carpenter in Cutter's Bluff for 40 years. He told her he had done work on the Mercer house before it was closed. He knew its bones. And then he said something that landed in her like a key turning. "Agnes Mercer told me once," he said, "that the thing her father hid was meant for the families. The ones the company drove off their land in the 30s when they bought up the ridge. He said he owed them a debt he couldn't pay in his lifetime. She said she didn't know how to pay it either, but she knew it was in that house." Adeline stood very still in the thin November light coming through the county office window. "Which company?" she asked. August Yell looked at her steadily. "Harlan Price Timber," he said. "Cornelius Price's grandfather. Same family that owns half this county now." She knew the name. Everyone in Cutter's Bluff knew the Price family. Cornelius Price was the kind of man whose name appeared at the top of the donor lists at the church and the school and the historical society, a man whose generosity was public and whose power was the kind that didn't need to announce itself. His family had been in the county for 100 years. His grandfather had built the original mill. The Prices were, in the language of small towns, founding people. The kind whose past nobody looked at too carefully because it would be inconvenient for everyone. Something settled in Adeline's chest. Not anger exactly. Not yet. More like the click of two things fitting together that you hadn't known were supposed to fit. She had almost no idea what she was doing. What she did have was Emmett Farrow's draw knife and 4 years of learning from a man who believed that if you paid close attention to the grain of a thing, eventually it would tell you which way to cut. She started paying attention. She spent 2 weeks finding out everything the county records would tell her about the Mercer property and the Harlan Price Timber Company's land acquisitions in the 1930s. The records were dry and dense, and she read them in the evenings, after her workbench hours. The lamp pulled close, her eyes going dry. What she found was not dramatic. It was quiet and systematic and deeply ugly. Parcel after parcel, transferred for almost nothing. The documentation thin. The dates clustered around a single season in 1933 when the county was at its most desperate and the timber company had the most leverage. 11 families. 11 parcels. All of it folded now into what Cornelius Price called the family holdings. She needed to get into that house. She went back to August Yell. He met her at the diner on a Saturday morning, ordered coffee he didn't drink, and listened to her lay out what she'd found. When she was finished, he was quiet for a while. The diner noise went on around them, the familiar sound of a small town's weekend, forks and voices, and Florence Roush's laugh from somewhere near the kitchen. Then August said, "I'm too old to climb anything, but I know where Agnes kept the spare key." He told her it was under the third step of the back porch, which Agnes had left because she'd locked herself out twice, and the locksmith charged $12. He told her the back door, stuck in cold weather, and you had to lift it slightly to clear the frame. He told her the house had been dry when he last worked on it, and the structure was sound, though the porch railing on the east side was a hazard. He looked at her over his coffee cup, which he still hadn't touched. "I'll come with you," he said, "not for any share of whatever's there, because Agnes Mercer was a decent woman, and she deserved to have her wishes honored. And because I'm curious," he added, with the first small smile she'd seen from him. "And at my age, curiosity is about the only thing worth getting out of bed for." They went on a Tuesday morning, early, when the street was empty and the frost was still hard on the grass. The key was where he said it would be. The door stuck exactly as he'd described, and she lifted it with both hands, and it swung inward with a long, low creak that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than wood. The house smelled of closed time, of old paper and dried lavender, and the particular stillness of a room where the air hasn't moved in years. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of something preserved, not rotted. The furniture was covered in sheets, shapes under pale cloth like sleeping things. The floors were dusty but solid. The plaster walls were clean. Agnes Mercer had not abandoned this place. She had put it to bed. They moved through the rooms carefully. Adeline had brought a flashlight and her tool roll, though she wasn't sure yet what she'd need the tools for. August moved slowly, but with the particular confidence of a man who understood structures, pausing occasionally to press a hand flat against a wall or look up at a joint. The front parlor, the kitchen, the small room off the back that had been a sewing room. Then the stairs, which they took one at a time, testing each riser. The upstairs hall, 3 bedrooms, all sheeted. The last room at the end of the hall was locked. Not an old lock, a new one relatively. A padlock, the kind you buy at a hardware store, fitted onto a hasp that had been screwed into the doorframe with care. Agnes Mercer had locked it herself, recently enough that the screws were still bright. Adeline looked at August. August looked at the lock. She thought about the draw knife in her tool roll. She thought about Emmett Farrow, sitting by the window in October light, pressing the handle into her hands, saying, "The weight of it will teach you." She thought about the 11 parcels in the county records, the 11 families, the dates all clustered in the same terrible season. She wasn't breaking in. She was completing something Agnes Mercer had started and not known how to finish. She took out the brace and a flat bit, placed the tip against the hasp plate, and with slow, steady pressure, worked out the screws. 4 of them. The hasp came free. The door opened. The room was small. A single window, shuttered, letting in thin lines of gray morning light. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table, arranged with unmistakable deliberateness, were 3 things. A wooden box, the kind used for document storage, sealed with a simple clasp. A leather ledger, its cover cracked and dark with age, and a handwritten note, on paper that had browned at the edges but see its ink, addressed in careful cursive to whoever has the courage to open this room and the conscience to do what it asks. Adeline's hands, which had handled wood and tools and rough materials every day for 4 years, were not quite steady when she reached for the note. She read it aloud, quietly, for August's benefit. It was from Howard Mercer, Agnes's father. It was dated 1941. It explained that the box contained the original deed records, the private correspondence of the Harlan Price Timber Company's county agent, and sworn statements from 7 of the 11 displaced families, gathered by Howard Mercer at personal risk during the years after the takeovers. He had kept them, he wrote, because he had worked for the company as a surveyor and seen what was done and said nothing at the time. And this was the weight he had carried since. He had not known how to bring it forward without destroying himself along with it. He hoped whoever found it would know better than he had. The ledger was the company's internal record of the transactions, the payments made to county officials, the names, the dates, the amounts. They did not say much, she and August Yell, standing in that small room with the gray November light coming through the shutters in thin lines. There are moments that don't call for words, that ask instead for a kind of stillness, a willingness to hold the weight of a thing before deciding what to do with it. Then, August said quietly, His voice, the voice of an old man who has lived long enough to know what things cost. There are people in this county whose grandparents lost those parcels. Some of them are still here. She knew what had to happen next. She also knew that it would not be simple. Cornelius Price's name was on the Historical Society. His family's name was on the new wing of the county library. He was not a man who would accept this quietly, and she was a 22-year-old woman with $31 in her boot and a borrowed room above a hardware store. She carried the box and the ledger down the stairs carefully, the way you carry something that belongs to other people. August carried the note. It was on the way out that she noticed it. She nearly walked past it, but the texture caught her eye the way textures do when your hands have been trained to notice them. A slight irregularity in the baseboard of the hallway, near the floor, where the wood met the plaster. She crouched down, pressed her fingers along the seam. There, fitted flush into the baseboard, almost invisible unless you were close and your hands knew what to look for, was a small panel. Not a door exactly. More like a drawer built into the baseboard itself, 3 inches tall and perhaps 8 wide, with no handle, just a tight-fitted edge. She took the draw knife from her tool roll. Not to pry with, it wasn't made for that, but to slide the thin spine of the blade along the seam, feeling for the give. There was a catch, a simple friction fit, and with steady lateral pressure it released. Inside the panel was a canvas envelope, folded twice. She lifted it out. Inside the envelope were 11 certificates. Land deeds, original issued copies, one for each of the parcels. Howard Mercer had not only kept the evidence, he had kept the proof of what those families had owned. She sat back on her heels in the hallway of the closed house, holding the certificates, and, for the first time since she'd arrived in Cutter's Bluff, she felt something that wasn't quite determination, and wasn't quite grief, and wasn't quite hope, but was some combination of all three that doesn't have a simple name. The feeling of something being returned. What happened in the weeks that followed was not clean or quick. These things never are. She went first to Herschel Dodd, because she needed someone the town trusted, and because he had told her, in his way, that Agnes Mercer had deserved to have her wishes honored. Herschel read the note and the first pages of the ledger without expression. Then he sat quietly for a moment and said, "I'll call Reverend Adkins." Reverend Adkins, it turned out, was the grandson of one of the 11 families. The documents went to a lawyer in the county seat, a woman named Patricia Birch, who took the case on the basis of what she called a clear record of documented fraud, and who seemed to draw a particular energy from the word Price that suggested this was not entirely a new story to her. Cornelius Price did not accept it quietly. He called the documents forgeries. He had his own lawyer, and then 2 more. He appeared at the county meeting and spoke, at length, about his family's contribution to the community, about the disruptions this was causing, about what he described as a campaign by outsiders to destroy what generations had built. He looked once, across the room at Adeline, and the look was the kind that is meant to remind you of the difference in your respective positions, to make you feel the cold air of that difference, to make you want to step back and say, "I'm sorry, I think I made a mistake." She had been looked at that way before, by the son who'd held the door. She did not step back. Patricia Birch presented the ledger and the correspondence and the sworn statements and the 11 original deeds. The county surveyor authenticated the documents. The handwriting in the ledger was matched to existing records of the Harlan Price Timber Company from the state archives. One by one, the arguments came apart. It was not a total victory. It never is. The land itself, after 60 years in subsequent development, could not simply be returned parcel for parcel. What the court ordered was a restitution settlement, drawn against the Price family holdings, paid to the descendants of the 11 families. It was not everything those families had lost. No amount of money is ever everything. But it was something true, something acknowledged, something on record. And in the county meeting where the settlement was announced, there were people whose grandparents' names were finally said aloud in a room with the correct weight attached to them. Cornelius Price was not jailed. The crimes were those of his grandfather's company, and the law has its limits. But he left the County Historical Society Board, and the new wing of the library was quietly rededicated. And the Price family's particular kind of unchallenged authority, the authority of a name that doesn't need to explain itself, was not what it had been. A thing can be changed without being destroyed. Sometimes that is the most that can be asked of justice. Adeline stayed in Cutter's Bluff. She hadn't planned to. She'd thought of herself all those months as someone passing through, someone in a temporary room, doing temporary work until something more permanent revealed itself. But something had shifted in the way the town held her, or in the way she held the town. She wasn't entirely sure which, and when Herschel Dodd offered her the vacant space behind the hardware store at a rent she could actually pay, the room large enough for a proper workshop, she said yes before she'd finished thinking about it. She set up the bench, hung the tools, put Emmett Farrow's draw knife on a pair of small wooden pegs on the wall where she could see it while she worked, not as a relic, but as a reminder of where things came from and what they were for. August Yell came by the first week and sat on an overturned crate and watched her work without saying much. He brought a piece of cherry wood he'd been holding on to, too good to use without the right occasion, and set it on the bench. "Make something that lasts," he said. She didn't answer him, just picked up the draw knife, felt the familiar weight settle into her palm, and bent to the wood. Outside, the town went about its business. The mill ran. The diner filled and emptied and filled again. Florence Rausch laughed from somewhere you couldn't see. The Mercer house, at the end of Mallow Street, still stood behind its overgrown lilac bushes. But someone had opened the shutters, and in the afternoons the light came through the glass and fell across the old floors in long golden bars, the way light does when a room has been let to breathe again after a long time of being held closed. We've been thinking since we first heard this story about what it means to carry something. Not just the weight of a tool or a box of papers, but the weight of a wrong that's been sitting in a locked room for 60 years, waiting for someone patient enough to look for the seam, careful enough to feel for the give. Adeline Holt wasn't looking for treasure. She was looking for solid ground, and she found it the same way she found everything else, one careful cut at a time, paying attention to the grain. What about you? If you had been the one to open that door, what would you have done with what was inside? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please leave a like and subscribe to Homestead Stories, because there are always more stories like this one. Stories of quiet courage, and the things people leave behind for someone with the right hands to find.